20th century citizen could travel back in time, he would find the Europe of the 1860s somewhat uncomfortable and inconvenient, lacking some amenities, but still much the same sort of world as his own. But if he continued back for another 100 years, he would be in a foreign, often incomprehensible world. No large towns, vast tracts of countryside, uninhabited except for the occasional hunting party. A population in most countries servile, and everywhere ignorant, violent, illiterate. In little more than 100 years, the world we live in was created. Modern Europe did not begin all at once, but two events, the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, contributed more than most to its formation. The one spread the ideas and politics of a new society. The other, the means and motives of change, of wealth and welfare, of urban industrialized society. Myths gather round all events, even the French Revolution. But there is much truth in these images of the peasant crushed by the burden of church and aristocracy. It's not easy to say exactly when the French Revolution began. Perhaps in June 1789, when the Estates General defied their king, Louis XVI. On the 14th of July, the Paris mob took the Bastille, that symbol of despotism, injustice, arbitrary arrest, imprisonment. In fact, there were no political prisoners in the Bastille. Nevertheless, these were the decisive days of the revolution. The episode deserves the glorification given to it by posterity. The Place de la Bastille, where the prison once stood. After the storming of the Bastille, Paris was tense. Abolition of privilege and apportioning of the great estates of the monasteries and landowners all paid lip service to these reforms. And yet, distrust and suspicion grew as the representatives of the old order, the three estates, nobility, clergy, and people, hammered out a new constitution. Then, Austria and Prussia attacked, believing they would be welcomed as liberators. But this foreign invasion turned the revolution into a national patriotic cause. The Reign of Terror itself was quite largely a war measure. The guillotine was not an instrument of class warfare, scything down the flower of the aristocracy. Its victims, 17,000 or so, were mainly war criminals. The towering figures of the revolution were all engaged in fighting this war. The guillotine was used for vicious infighting, for the liquidation of Robespierre's opponents, and eventually of Robespierre himself. But it did hold together a disintegrating nation, imposed a central authority. It saved France and the revolution. The French Revolution is of momentous importance, not because it overthrew a monarch. This had been done in England 130 years before. Not because it proclaimed high-minded, if rather vague, principles. The Americans had done as much to support their revolution against England. Nor, in spite of good intentions, was the revolutionary government particularly enlightened and progressive. But two features of the French Revolution made it the property of all Europe, and eventually of the entire Western world. First, it turned the idea of the kingdom, the property of the king inhabited by dutiful subjects, governed by the privileged few, into la patrie, the nation, the fatherland to which all belonged, equal citizens in a united community. It was an explosive idea. And secondly, French armies crossed the frontiers and set out to revolutionize Europe. It was a secular reformation, the most successful and influential crusade to date. Napoleon Bonaparte first came to notice when he put down a Parisian riot with his decisive whiff of grape shot. His brilliance was soon confirmed by a series of dazzling victories. So, when the politicians looked for a man to sort out their troubles and purge their opponents, they saw Bonaparte. But in 1799, his grenadiers swept the deputies and their talking shop away and inaugurated what amounted to his personal rule as Citizen Bonaparte, first consul of the Republic. 5 years later, he took for himself the title of Emperor and crowned his wife Josephine Empress. But even as Emperor, Napoleon was the revolution incarnate, the supreme example of the career open to talent. With consummate statesmanship, he consolidated the gains of the revolution. In a great series of law codes, he guaranteed equality and personal liberty, abolished privilege and oppression. These are the foundation of all law in the Western world, outside the Anglo-Saxon countries. His systems of administration, police, justice, education proved almost equally permanent. A vital stroke, he signed the Concordat of 1802 with the Pope, and so reconciled the revolution with the Church of Rome. Under his rule, society recovered much of its old elegance. Napoleon took his armies east. In a series of brilliant battles, he won Egypt. His ambitions to gain a huge Eastern Empire were checked by Nelson and the British fleet. But in Europe, the French were everywhere triumphant. Citizen soldiers, free men inspired by a cause, they made matchwood of the traditional mercenary armies who opposed them. So began an apparently limitless series of victories, and Napoleon filled Paris with monuments glorifying his army. This column in the Place Vendôme commemorates the Battle of Austerlitz. The Church of the Madeleine, dedicated to the Grande Armée. Napoleon intended that his Arc de Triomphe should be surmounted by the bronze horses from St. Mark's in Venice, the same horses that the Emperor Constantine had carried from Rome to Constantinople. The Venetians themselves had acquired them when Constantinople was sacked by the Crusaders in the 13th century. This was the empire that the French conquered. The lands ruled directly from Paris, and the satellite states under Napoleonic control. To all these lands, French administrators carried the revolutionary influences, the Napoleonic codes, the ideas of equality, citizenship, and nationhood, the abolition of privilege for both church and aristocracy. In a sense, Europe has ever since been divided between the countries which knew French rule and those that did not. Napoleon's brother, Joseph, was king of Spain, but he was unable to subdue or pacify it. Spain was to be the running sore in the side of the empire. England exploited the Spanish situation. She used her industrial wealth and control of the seas to reinforce the enemies of France. Napoleon made preparations for invasion, as this fanciful print suggests, thought better of it. Instead, he launched his Grande Armée, 600,000 men, against Russia. The Russian generals retreated, exploited the vast spaces of their country, destroyed and burned food and shelter as they retired. Napoleon could not bring them to a decisive battle. The Grande Armée reached and occupied Moscow. Napoleon entered the Kremlin fortress through this gate. Moscow, too, went up in flames. The French had no alternative but to retrace their path across the now frozen steppes. The Cossacks and the Russian winter did the rest. Of the 600,000, almost 500,000 died on this retreat. At last, the star of the man of destiny began to sink. Defeated by the revitalized and reformed armies of the old dynasties, he bade farewell to his troops and was exiled to the island of Elba. But while his victors were discussing the fate of Europe, Napoleon escaped, returned to France. The army came over to him. It was at Waterloo that he was finally defeated by the combined forces of the English and Prussians. The Old Guard, Napoleon's elite troops, make their final attempt to break the British squares. At the Congress of Vienna, the statesmen of Europe struggled with the task of returning his empire to the old hereditary monarchies. They were obsessed by the fear of renewed revolution. Their fears were soon justified, for in 1830, the Parisians rose in rebellion against the restored Bourbon monarchy. Their example was imitated right across the continent. The spirit of liberty still haunted Europe. In every country, secret societies, groups of liberals, bands of revolutionaries waited their time to raise once more the flag of revolution. From the 60 years following the French Revolution, Britain emerged as the first industry state, one where most of the people and wealth were employed in non-agricultural pursuits. The Great Exhibition of 1851, the fairy tale Crystal Palace, was a thanksgiving for this miracle, a celebration of the rights of industrial progress. Until the 19th century, it was taken for granted that farming would be the overwhelming preoccupation of a country and its people. Britain did not experience the upheavals of the European mainland. The agitation of the Chartists was the nearest she came to it. But the English Parliament had already been reformed. Chartism failed to provoke revolution. Her stable institutions, her plentiful coal supplies, which lay close to deposits of easily worked iron ore, marked Britain as the birthplace of a modern industrial economy.